I didn't notice anything was wrong at first. It was one of those evenings that feels softer than the rest, like the day is exhaling before it goes dark. The kind where the sky turns pale orange, then lavender, then slowly fades into that deep blue that always makes me pause what I'm doing. Cash had been restless all afternoon, pacing between the porch and the yard, nails clicking softly against the wood floor, tail wagging but not quite relaxed. I remember thinking he just had too much energy, too much daylight left in him. We live far enough out that silence isn't really silent. There are crickets, wind in the trees, the distant hum of something you can't quite place. I stepped outside with my mug, steam curling up into the cooling air, and watched him wander toward the tree line. He always liked to patrol a bit before coming back in. It was normal, comfortable, part of our rhythm. But that night, he didn't turn around. At first, I laughed under my breath and called his name the way I always do. Casual, familiar. Cash, come on, buddy. My voice floated out across the yard, and for a second I expected to see that white blur spin around and come bounding back toward me, tongue out, proud of himself for no reason at all. Instead, he stopped, completely still, right at the edge of the trees. I lowered my mug slowly. The air felt different then. Not colder exactly, just heavier. Like the quiet had thickened. Cash's ears were forward, his tail no longer wagging, his posture alert in a way I hadn't seen before. Not playful, not curious. Focused. He wasn't growling. He wasn't barking. That almost scared me more. I called him again, a little firmer this time. Cash inside. The word inside usually did it. He loved the routine of it, the treat, the way I'd scratch behind his ears before locking the door. But he didn't move. Didn't even glance back at me. It was like his whole attention had been pulled somewhere else. I remember thinking maybe there was a deer, or a fox, or some animal just out of sight. That would have made sense. That would have been easy. But there was no sound. No rustling. No snapping of twigs. Just him, standing there, watching. I stepped off the porch and felt the grass damp under my feet. I hadn't planned on going closer, but my body moved before my thoughts caught up. "Hey," I said softly, not wanting to startle him. "What do you see?" My voice sounded smaller outside, like the night swallowed some of it before it reached him. That's when he shifted his weight, just slightly, like he was bracing himself. A strange unease settled in my chest. I'd had Cash long enough to trust his instincts more than my own. He was gentle, goofy, affectionate to a fault. If something made him stand like that, I paid attention. I took another step forward, then stopped when he finally turned his head, just enough to look back at me. His eyes didn't look scared. They looked conflicted, like he wanted to come back, like he was waiting for something to finish. I checked my phone without really knowing why. The signal was weak, one bar flickering in and out. The time blinked back at me, later than I thought it was. Dusk had slipped into night without asking permission. I looked back up, and the tree line seemed darker now, deeper, like the woods had expanded while I wasn't looking. "Cash," I said again, softer now. "Please." He didn't respond. He took one step forward instead, not toward me, toward the trees. My stomach dropped. I moved quickly then, heart kicking harder than it should have. "No, Cash, stop." My voice cracked, just a little, and this time he froze again. Right on the edge, half in the open, half swallowed by shadow. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of damp earth and leaves, and something else I couldn't name. I realized then how quiet everything had become. No crickets, no birds. Even the wind had gone still. I stood there, barefoot in the grass, watching my dogs stare into the woods like they were staring back. And for the first time since I'd moved out here, I felt like I wasn't alone. I don't know how long we stood there like that. Time does strange things when you're waiting for something you can't see. Seconds stretch. Your thoughts start looping back on themselves. I remember wondering if this was how animals felt during storms, sensing something long before it arrived. Cash didn't blink much, just kept staring, breathing slow and steady, like he was listening with his whole body. I tried logic first. I always do. I told myself he was probably picking up on a scent carried by the wind, that maybe something had passed through earlier, and he was just late to the trail. Still, none of that explained why he wouldn't look away, or why the woods felt like they were holding their breath. I took another step closer and reached out my hand. "It's okay," I whispered, even though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince. "You can come back now." My fingers brushed his fur, warm and solid and reassuring. For a moment, I thought that would be enough. His ears twitched, his muscles loosened just a fraction. Then he pulled away, not sharply, not panicked, just a gentle but firm step out of reach. A quiet refusal. That's when I noticed the sound. Or rather, the absence of it wasn't complete anymore. Something deep in the woods made a low, uneven rustle. Not footsteps. Not quite movement. More like pressure shifting. Leaves settling. As if something large had adjusted its weight without wanting to be heard. Cash's head tilted slightly, his nose lifting, testing the air. My heart started beating faster, and I hated how loud it felt inside my chest. "Cash," I said again, this time with urgency slipping through. "That's enough." I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing out there in the open. The house behind me felt farther away than it should have been, the porch light a weak yellow circle in the distance. Cash let out a sound then, not a bark, not a growl, more like a breath pushed through his throat. A soft, uneasy huff that told me everything I needed to know. Whatever he was sensing wasn't a threat he could challenge. It wasn't something he wanted to chase. It was something he didn't understand. I took a step back toward the house, hoping he'd follow if I retreated first. "Inside," I said, clearer now, firmer. He didn't move, didn't even glance at me. It felt wrong, like the rules of our relationship had quietly shifted without asking permission. The wind picked up again, but only for a second. Just enough to stir the tops of the trees. Just enough to make them whisper. I told myself that was all it was. Whine through branches. Old wood creaking. Night sounds that feel bigger when you're alone. Still, the feeling in my chest wouldn't settle. I thought about all the stories people tell about rural places. About land remembering things. About sounds traveling differently after dark. I didn't believe most of that. But standing there, watching my dog refuse to leave the edge of the woods, I didn't dismiss it either. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small flashlight I keep on my key. The beam was narrow and weak, but it was something. I clicked it on and aimed it toward the tree line, sweeping slowly from left to right. The light caught bark, low branches, tangled undergrowth. Nothing moved, nothing reflected back. Until it did. For just a split second, something pale flickered between the trees. Not a shape I could define. Not eyes. Just a brief interruption of shadow, like the darkness had blinked. Cash stiffened immediately, his tail lifting, his weight shifting forward again. "No," I whispered, my throat tight now. "Don't." He took another step toward the woods. That's when I realized something that sent a cold ripple through me. He wasn't being pulled. He was being invited. There was no fear in his posture now. No alarm, just attention. Like someone had called his name without sound. Like whatever was out there knew exactly how to get him to listen. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and stepped forward again, fear and determination tangling together. I wasn't about to let him go alone. But as I moved closer, the woods seemed to move too. Not physically, not visibly. Just enough that the distance between us felt wrong. Like the space itself had stretched. Like the trees were farther away than they had been moments before. Cash stopped again, right at the threshold. And this time, he looked back at me with something that felt a lot like apology. As if he knew what came next. I don't know what scared me more. The way he looked at me, or the fact that he didn't wait for permission. Cash stepped into the trees. Not fully, not disappearing. Just far enough that the shadows swallowed the brightness of his fur, dulling it to a gray that blended too easily with the trunks around him. I felt a sharp jolt of panic, the kind that skips straight past thinking and lands directly in your chest. Cash, I said, louder now. Too loud. My voice echoed in a way that made the woods feel wider than they should have been. He stopped again, just inside the tree line. Branches framed him like a doorway. For a moment, nothing happened. The flashlight beam shook slightly in my hand as I followed the outline of his body, the familiar curve of his back, the plume of his tail held high but still. I waited for him to turn around, to snap out of whatever trance had taken hold. Instead, he lowered his head and sniffed the ground, slow and deliberate, like he was reading a story written in scent. I took a breath and stepped forward. The air under the trees felt different immediately. Cooler, denser. Like stepping into a room where someone had just blown out a candle. The smells changed too. Damp leaves, old bark, something faintly metallic underneath it all. The ground softened beneath my feet, and I had to watch where I stepped, roots twisting up through the soil like veins. Hey, I said again, softer now, careful not to spook him. You're okay. I'm right here. Cash didn't look back this time. Instead, he tilted his head toward something deeper in the woods, ears twitching, body angled like he was deciding whether to go further. My pulse picked up. I hated how natural it felt to follow him, how quickly my fear shifted into focus, into purpose. This was my dog, my responsibility. Whatever was happening, I wasn't going to stand at the edge and let it unfold without me. The trees closed in more than I expected. The yard disappeared behind me after just a few steps. The porch light reduced to a weak glow filtering through branches. I glanced back once, just to reassure myself it was still there. It was, barely. The house felt smaller already, like it was receding into memory instead of space. Cash stopped again, right beside an old oak. Its trunk was wide and deeply grooved, bark peeling in places like it had been shedding layers for years. Something about it tugged at my attention immediately. Not because it looked unusual, but because it looked used. The ground around it was worn down more than the rest of the forest floor. Leaves pushed aside, dirt compacted, like people had stood there before. I crouched slightly, shining my light at the base of the tree. That's when I saw it. A shallow indentation in the soil, oval-shaped, too smooth to be accidental. It wasn't a hole exactly, more like a depression where something heavy had rested over and over again. My stomach tightened. I scanned the area around it, noticing faint scuff marks leading away from the tree, paths that didn't quite look like animal trails. Cash sat down. That alone sent a chill through me. He never sat during patrols. Never stopped like this unless he was waiting. I moved closer, my hand brushing his back, feeling the tension humming under his fur. What is this place? I murmured, more to myself than to him. My voice sounded wrong here, like it didn't belong. That's when the sound came back. Not from deep in the woods this time. From behind us. A soft, almost careful crunch of leaves. I froze. Cash didn't move, didn't turn. His ears flicked once, just enough to tell me he'd heard it too. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly angled the flashlight over my shoulder, heart pounding hard enough to make my hands tremble. The beam swept across tree trunks, branches, empty space. Nothing. I stood there for a long second, waiting for another sound, my thoughts racing through possibilities I didn't want to name. When nothing happened, I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Probably just a raccoon, I whispered, even though the words felt thin. Cash finally stood up again. But instead of moving forward, he turned slightly, positioning himself between me and the darker part of the woods. It was subtle, easy to miss if you didn't know him the way I did. But I noticed, the way his body angled, the way his weight shifted. He was guarding. My throat went dry. Cash, I said quietly. Let's go home. I tugged gently at his collar, expecting resistance, expecting him to dig in his heels. Instead, he hesitated, looking back toward the oak one last time, then allowed himself to be guided away. The walk back felt longer than it should have been. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow felt like it lingered too long. I didn't look behind me again. I didn't want to know if something was watching us leave. When the yard finally opened up in front of us and the porch light washed over Cash's fur, relief hit me so hard my knees almost gave out. Inside, I locked the door without thinking. Cash paced the living room, restless, unsettled, stopping occasionally to sniff the door, then the windows. I filled his water bowl, my hands still shaking, and watched him drink like nothing had happened. Like we hadn't just stepped into something we didn't understand. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every time the house creaked, I listened. Every time the wind shifted, I wondered if it was carrying something with it. Cash slept near the bedroom door, instead of his usual spot at the foot of the bed. His body angled toward the hallway, alert even in rest. The next morning, when sunlight filled the room and the woods looked ordinary again, I almost convinced myself it had all been nothing. Almost. Until I noticed the mud on Cash's paws. Dark, sticky, and not from anywhere in my yard. I noticed the mud while I was pouring my coffee. Cash jumped onto the rug near the kitchen door, shook once, and left behind dark smudges that didn't match the rest of the dirt he usually tracked in. Our yard soil is lighter, sandy in places, quick to dry. This was heavier, almost black. It clung to the fibers like it didn't want to let go. I crouched down and touched it with my fingertips. Cold, damp, dense. "Where did you step, huh?" I asked quietly. Cash looked at me, ears relaxed now, tail giving a soft wag, like the night before had already slipped out of his mind. That scared me more than if he'd been agitated. Whatever he'd sensed out there, it hadn't followed him inside. Or maybe it didn't need to. I wiped my fingers on a paper towel and stood up, staring out the window toward the woods. Morning light softened everything. The tree line looked harmless, familiar. Birds hopped along the fence, and somewhere in the distance, a truck passed on the road. The world had resumed its normal rhythm without asking how I felt about it. I tried to do the same. The day moved slowly. I kept busy on purpose. Laundry, emails, small, grounding tasks that reminded me I was still in control of my space. Cash followed me around like usual, leaning into my legs, flopping down wherever I stopped. He was calm, happy, even. If I hadn't seen him the night before, I would have sworn nothing unusual had happened. By early afternoon, curiosity started to outweigh fear. I told myself I just wanted to understand the mud. That was the excuse, at least. I grabbed my boots, slipped on a jacket, and clipped Cash's leash before I could overthink it. "Just a quick walk," I said, more to myself than to him. He wagged hard, spinning in a circle, thrilled by the idea. We didn't go far at first. Just the edge of the yard. Just enough to convince myself everything was fine. But as we approached the trees, Cash slowed. His excitement fading into something quieter. Focused, he pulled slightly toward the same direction as the night before, nose low, following a trail I couldn't see. "Okay," I muttered. "Lead the way." The woods looked different in daylight. Less dramatic. Less intimidating. But the deeper we went, the more I noticed details I'd missed before. Bent branches, flattened leaves, subtle signs of repeated passage. Not animal paths exactly. Too deliberate, too consistent. We reached the oak faster than I expected. It looked older up close. Larger. Its bark was scarred in places, faint lines carved into it that didn't look natural. I ran my hand over one, feeling the groove beneath my palm. It wasn't deep, but it was intentional. Someone had pressed something sharp into the wood a long time ago. Cash stopped at the base of the tree again, sat, waited. I crouched beside him, scanning the ground more carefully this time. The depression I'd noticed the night before was clearer now. Around it were faint boot prints, partially eroded, overlapping each other like they'd been made over years, not days. My chest tightened. This wasn't just a place people passed through. It was a place they returned to. I stood up slowly and turned in a slow circle, trying to get my bearings. That's when I noticed the fence. It was old, half buried under brush and vines, rusted wire sagging between leaning posts. I hadn't seen it before because it didn't run along the property line. It cut through the woods at an odd angle, disappearing behind trees in both directions. "Have you seen this?" I whispered to Cash upstairs. We followed the fence for a short distance until it led us to a clearing. Not large, just enough space for sunlight to spill through uninterrupted. The ground there was bare, stripped of leaves, the soil packed down hard. At the center stood a single wooden post, weathered and cracked, leaning slightly to one side. It took me a second to understand what it was. An old marker? Not a grave? Not exactly. There was no name, no dates. Just a faded strip of cloth tied around it, gray with age, fluttering weakly in the breeze. My throat tightened as a memory stirred, uninvited. I remembered something the neighbor had said when I first moved in. It had been casual, offhand. We were talking about the land, the trees, how quiet it got at night. He'd laughed a little and said, "Yeah, folks used to gather back there once upon a time. Don't hear much about it now." I hadn't asked what he meant. Standing there now, I wished I had. Cash moved closer to the post, sniffed once, then turned away. His body language shifted, the tension easing like a decision had been made. Whatever interest he'd had before, it was gone now. I, on the other hand, felt rooted in place. I didn't touch the post. I didn't stay long. Something about the clearing felt finished, like it didn't want witnesses anymore. As we walked back toward the yard, I felt that same heavy quiet settle around us again, though the sun was still high. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see someone standing where the post was. Nothing was there. Back inside, I washed the mud off Cash's paws, watching it swirl darkly down the drain. I told myself I'd let it go. That the past was the past. That old land holds old stories, and not all of them need to be reopened. That night, though, when the porch light flicked on by itself, I stopped breathing. And when Cash stood up and faced the door without a sound, I knew the woods weren't finished with us yet. The porch light had a motion sensor. I reminded myself of that as I stood frozen in the hallway, heart pounding, watching the yellow glow spill through the front window. A raccoon? A deer? The wind shaking a branch just right. There were plenty of reasonable explanations, and I ran through all of them the way you do when your mind is trying to outrun your fear. Cash didn't move. He stood squarely in front of the door, body still, ears forward, tail low. Not aggressive, not alarmed. Just alert in that quiet, disciplined way that told me he was tracking something without sound. I held my breath, listening past the hum of the refrigerator, past the faint ticking of the wall clock. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no knocking. After a long moment, the porch light clicked off again, plunging the yard back into darkness. Cash relaxed just a fraction, then padded back toward the living room as if the moment had passed. But it hadn't. I didn't sleep much that night. Again, morning brought fog. Thick and low, curling around the trees like smoke that hadn't decided where to go yet. Cash pressed his nose against the window, watching it with quiet interest while I stood behind him, coffee cooling in my hands. The woods were barely visible, reduced to vague shapes and shadows. It felt like the land was hiding something on purpose. That was when I decided to talk to the neighbor. He lives a few acres down the road, in a house that looks like it's been added onto more times than anyone remembers. We'd exchanged polite waves before, small talk about weather and road conditions, nothing personal. Still, when I pulled into his gravel driveway later that morning, my stomach twisted with nerves I couldn't quite explain. He answered the door slowly, like he'd been expecting someone else. "Oh," he said, squinting slightly. "It's you. Sorry to bother you, I replied, forcing a smile. I just had a quick question about the woods behind my place. That did it? His expression shifted. Not surprise, not confusion. Recognition. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him, glancing past me toward the road before settling his eyes back on mine. What about them? I found something back there, I said carefully. An old fence. A clearing. A post. He didn't respond right away, just rubbed his jaw, eyes narrowing as if he were deciding how much to say. Cash sat at my side, calm but attentive, watching him closely. People used to gather there, he finally said, echoing his earlier comment. Long time ago. Before your house was built. Before most of this was. Gather for what? I asked. He exhaled slowly. Depends who you ask. We stood there in silence, the fog drifting between us, until he continued. Some folks said it was just meetings. Others said it was something else. Traditions carried over from somewhere else. Beliefs that didn't quite fit anymore once people started spreading out. Why doesn't anyone talk about it? I asked. He shrugged. Because nothing good ever came from it. That night, as dusk crept in again, I stayed inside. Locked the doors early. Drew the curtains. Cash settled near my feet, content, like he was keeping watch simply by being there. I tried to focus on the quiet comfort of the house, the small sounds that meant safety. But around the same time as the night before, the wind picked up. It didn't howl, didn't rattle the windows. It moved low, slow, brushing against the siding, circling the house like it was testing the edges. Cash lifted his head, ears twitching, then stood and walked toward the back door instead of the front. I followed him. The porch light hadn't turned on this time. The yard beyond the glass was dark, but not empty. I couldn't see anything clearly, yet I felt it, the same way you feel someone standing just out of sight. Cash sat and stared, unmoving. Then, softly, from somewhere beyond the trees, came a sound I hadn't expected. A whistle. Low, slow, tuneless, not calling, not signaling, waiting. Cash didn't react the way I thought he would. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply leaned into my leg, pressing his weight against me like he was reminding himself where he belonged. I rested my hand on his head, fingers threading through his fur, grounding myself in the warmth of him. The whistle stopped. The silence that followed felt deliberate. I don't know how long we stood there like that, listening to nothing. Eventually, Cash turned away first, leading me back toward the center of the house. I locked the door behind us and leaned against it, heart racing. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. Whatever had been calling to him that first night hadn't been trying to take him. It had been trying to see if he'd answer. And now that it knew he wouldn't, it was paying attention to me instead. The next morning, the fog was gone. The air felt lighter, like the land had finally exhaled after holding something in too long. Sunlight filtered through the trees in clean, sharp lines, and birds moved freely again, loud and careless in a way they hadn't been for days. Cash stretched in the doorway, tail thumping once against the frame, already back to his usual self. The normalcy almost felt rude. I stood there for a long time, watching the woods from a distance. Not afraid anymore. Not curious either. Just aware. I thought about what the neighbor had said. About people gathering. About traditions that didn't fit once the world moved on. There are places like that everywhere. Pieces of the past that never quite dissolve. They don't haunt you the way stories say they do. They linger. They wait to see who notices. And sometimes, they test boundaries. I didn't go back to the oak. I didn't follow the fence again. Some things don't need confrontation to be understood. What mattered was the choice that had already been made. Cash had been invited, and he had refused. Quietly, without drama, without fear, he had come back to me instead. That meant something. Over the next few days, life settled into its familiar rhythm. Cash patrolled the yard like always, but he never stopped at the tree line again. Never stood still and listened the way he had that first night. The porch light stayed off. The wind moved normally. The woods returned to being just woods. Still, I changed a few things. I started keeping the porch light on at dusk, not because I was scared, but because it felt like a statement. I planted a small line of shrubs near the edge of the yard, a gentle boundary where there hadn't been one before. I walked the property with Cash every morning, letting him sniff and explore, reinforcing what belonged to us and what didn't. Land responds to intention. I believe that now. On the anniversary of that night, almost without realizing it, I found myself standing on the porch again as dusk rolled in. Cash sat beside me, close enough that I could feel his warmth through my jeans. The woods were dark, quiet, ordinary. Nothing called out, nothing waited. I reached down and scratched behind his ears, and he leaned into my hand with a contented sigh. In that moment, I understood what he'd known all along. Not everything that reaches out is meant to be answered. Not every invitation deserves curiosity. Some doors stay closed not because we're afraid of what's behind them, but because we're finally sure of where we belong. Cash lifted his head and looked at me, eyes soft, trusting, present. I smiled and nudged the door open with my foot, letting the warm light of the house spill out behind us. "Come on," I said gently. "Let's go inside." He followed without hesitation, and the woods stayed quiet. I still think about that night sometimes, not in a fearful way. More like the way you remember a conversation that changed you without raising its voice. The woods never did anything dramatic after that. No lights, no sounds, no signs meant to scare me into believing something extraordinary had happened. And maybe that's the point. Some places don't need to prove themselves. They just need to be noticed. To see who's paying attention, who listens, who understands when to step back instead of stepping closer. Cash taught me that. He didn't fight whatever was out there. He didn't chase it. He didn't try to understand it. He simply chose where he belonged and stayed there. With me. With the warmth of the house. With the life we've built quietly, day by day. Since then, the woods have gone back to being just woods. Beautiful, mysterious, full of things I don't need to know the names of. I walk near them, not into them. I respect the line where light fades into shadow, and I'm at peace with not crossing it. Some invitations aren't meant to be answered. Some doors aren't locked to keep us out, but to keep us safe. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is turn around and go home. If stories like this speak to you, if you enjoy quiet mysteries, slow moments, and the feeling of a lantern glowing against the dark, I'd love to have you here. You can subscribe to Cabinlight Stories and come back anytime you need a calm place to sit with a story and listen. Cash and I will be right here.